Hi, students. I apologize. I've been out a couple days uh, in an effort to get you all to the point where we can start writing your essays. What I'm going to do is I'm going to finish our slideshow on the Puritans through video, so that when I do come back, we can really just jump into our essay writing. So here's what I want to do before I finish our slideshow here. Let me just recap some of the main ideas from the last time I saw you on Tuesday. So we learned about the economics of Massachusetts Bay. The big thing I want you to take away from that is that the economy of colonial New England was very diversified. Farming was the main activity, but you also had shipbuilding, lumber, mining, you name it, entrepreneurship, trades, a lot of different economic activities. Next, we also talked about the religion of the Puritans and how they were Calvinists and they believed in something called predestination, where they thought that every human being deserved to go to hell, but God granted some people the ability to go to heaven, and nobody knew who was going to heaven or hell, and that was a key defining characteristic. Then we talked about the Puritans as people, and I explained to you that there's really only two activities the Puritans participated in, and that would be religion, praying, going to church, and the second would be working hard at their job, whether it be farmer, baker, lawyer, minister, you name it. They thought that every job was holy, and they thought that the community was much more important than the individual. So because the Puritans moved to America to form a religious utopia, they in a sense thought that, contributing to your community, being a good member of the community, helping your neighbor, things like that was very important. Then we talked about education. There's two major educational achievements that I want you to be aware of when we talk about the Puritans and colonial New England. Firstly, public school systems. So the Puritans have a law that says once 50 people move into a town, that by law that town has to build a school and hire a teacher. And the reason why they valued public schooling so much is that they thought that every child, every person had to be able to read the Bible themselves, and not all other Christian churches believe that. The other big educational achievement was the founding of the first college in colonial America called Harvard. And like you all pointed out, Harvard is one of those Ivy League colleges, very old, very prestigious. But if anything, founding a college shows how much the Puritans valued education. And then just a couple things involving government. The Puritans believed in something called the town meeting. So several times per year, all the men would gather at the town hall, and they would have elections. They would solve the town's problems, and they felt that like everybody's opinion mattered. And then the last thing in terms of government was Puritan Massachusetts was a theocracy, which meant that there was no separation between church and state. In Puritan New England, the church was the government and the government was the church. And our last little bullet point here, the Puritans were not interested in dissenters. So they moved to America saying, we're perfect. Either do what we do or leave. And what we're going to see in this little video lesson is that people who didn't agree with the Puritans, the Puritans didn't treat them too well. And I'll give you a few examples of that. Okay, so let's say a few more things about community. So in Puritan New England, it was a collection, besides Boston, a collection of small towns that was based on something called a religious covenant. And I would actually highlight that term, religious covenant, because they actually thought that like God wanted them to come to America, God wanted them to form a religious community, God wanted them to live a religious lifestyle. So they feel like they're bonded to their fellow townspeople. They cooperated with each other. They had a common bond, their religion, and they felt like they were doing something special in America as a group, which is much different than the isolation in the colonial Chesapeake. So if you look at a New England village, what you see is that the houses were very close together, and then in the middle of town, there'd be like a little park area called a common. There'd be a meeting house, there'd be a church, and there'd be a school. So if you were to ever see a map of colonial New England, all the villages had the similar structure. Houses around the outside, and in the middle of town, a common park area, a meeting house, a church, and a school. All right, that's like boilerplate, the same everywhere. What we see though is that as time goes on, these family farms start to get divided up because kids start claiming their inheritances, and we see that there does become some tension in these little colonial villages. And then we've already talked about it, but Boston is a very important city in colonial New England. One thing we'll see is that the colonial Chesapeake never really developed a major city. Well, not at least at first. Baltimore does end up becoming a major city, but in the colonial era, Boston really is established as an important place. And we talked about that, so I think we're good there. So let's talk about these dissenters. Who are these people that didn't agree with the Puritans? So the first name you need to be aware of, and I would highlight his name, Roger Williams. So Roger Williams arrives in Puritan, Massachusetts. And from the moment he arrives, Roger Williams starts expressing these very radical opinions. So he starts saying, wait a second, you guys didn't buy this land, you just took it? He said, that's not right. And then he says, wait a second, you guys don't have separation of church and state, like the church is the government? He goes, that's wrong. And then what ends up happening is that the Puritan leaders basically say, we got to get this guy, and we got to get rid of him. So much so that like Roger Williams's friends tell him, like, you need to leave because the government's out to get you. So Roger Williams just couldn't understand why the Puritans couldn't treat the Native Americans with respect and why they couldn't give people freedom of religion. So what happened was, and I would highlight this word, Roger Williams was banished. He was kicked out of Massachusetts. So what Roger Williams does is he goes south. He meets some nice Native Americans. He claims a little piece of land, and he basically says, I'm going to make my own colony, and that is the colony, and now the state of Rhode Island. And Rhode Island was a special place in colonial America because Rhode Island was one of the only places, Rhode Island and Pennsylvania, that had full religious freedom. So literally in Rhode Island, you could believe whatever you wanted, and we view this as important, and Roger Williams is an important guy because eventually in the United States, like today, we have freedom of religion. And it's because of people like Roger Williams who kind of fought against the system in colonial America. And what Roger Williams believed back then and got in trouble for has now become the norm in the United States. So that's really important. Another rebel that we should be aware of is a woman, Anne Hutchinson. So Anne Hutchinson started kind of doing too much thinking for herself in terms of from the Puritan Church's point of view. Anne Hutchinson argued that every person had the capability to directly communicate with God, and the Puritans did not believe that. Also, Anne Hutchinson started having prayer meetings in her home against the wishes of Puritan ministers. So just like with Roger Williams, Anne Hutchinson was banished. She was kicked out of colonial Massachusetts, never to return. But once again, if it wasn't for people like Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson fighting the system and doing what they wanted and kind of worshiping religion in their own way, maybe we wouldn't have freedom of religion today. So those are two very important people who fought against the Puritan leadership and ended up leaving Massachusetts because they just didn't like the way that the Puritans were running things. So here's the debate, right? I guess you could make an argument that the Puritans were hypocrites, and a hypocrite means when you say one thing but you do another. An argument could be made that the Puritans, the reason why they came to America was for religious freedom. And I would highlight that, right? That's the reason why the Puritans come to America. In England, people didn't like their views, so the Puritans pick up their lives and move to America. But here's the hypocritical part, is that the Puritans moved to America for religious freedom, but once people start questioning the Puritans in America, all of a sudden, the Puritans don't give other people freedom of religion. Now, I think there's a reasoning here. The Puritans thought that they were a utopia. They thought that they were creating a perfect society in America. So when the Puritans come to America, they make it very clear that they are going to live a certain way. And if you don't like the way that the Puritans are doing things, that you are not welcome in Massachusetts. And this is ultimately why Rhode Island becomes a colony. This is why Connecticut becomes a colony. Unhappy Puritans move there. This is why New Hampshire becomes a colony, because there were just a lot of people that didn't really want to live the way that the Puritans were living and wanted to do things their own way. Okay, so just like I just explained, right? If we look at this map here, we see where Massachusetts Bay was and where the Puritans landed, but then we see New Hampshire is to the north, the Pilgrims settle in Plymouth to the south, Roger Williams forms Rhode Island in 1636. That's to the south. And then we see that Connecticut is formed in the 1630s. So as people started getting fed up with the Puritans, they started spreading all throughout New England, doing things their own way and forming new colonies. Okay, so our last topic for today is there was a major Native American war in the 1670s between the Puritans and Native Americans, and that was called King Philip's War. So what happened was, as more and more Puritan people landed in New England, it's the same story as the Chesapeake. The English settlers start moving inland. They start fencing off property. The Puritans start having their farm animals roam the countryside. And the Native American chief, his name was Metacom, but the English called him King Philip. He fought back. So what we see is that the Native Americans that got desperate, and Native Americans just started going into Puritan villages and slaughtering people. And then the Puritans started going to Native American villages and slaughtering people. So it was very deadly, very ugly. So in 1675, 3 Native Americans were hanged, right? Then King Philip decides to get revenge, and then the English get revenge, and then in 1678, full-on war breaks out. Villages are burned, men, women, children were killed or sold into slavery. So I don't need you to know every little detail of King Philip's War, but you should be aware that it took place in New England and that it was an example of Native Americans fighting back against English settlers. All right, guys, so I think I was able to keep this at about 12 minutes. So hopefully you were able to get everything, and I would like you to take the rest of the period to keep working on your essay. If you feel like you need to work on your vocab assignment that is due next Tuesday instead, you can work on that. But please work on either your essay or your vocab. All right, guys, I'm going to try to be back on Friday, but I'll see you soon.